All right, for those that don't know me, my name's Cody Maxwell, Fannin County Extension Agent for Ag and Natural Resources, and we will be talking about insect pest of pastures and hay meadows on today's webinar. So first and foremost, we're going to start with the ever-dreaded fall armyworm. And if we were able to see everybody right now, I would ask for a show of hands to see who has dealt with the armyworms. And I guarantee you, without seeing you, that probably about 90 to 95% of you on this webinar have dealt with the fall armyworm. As you can see in the picture there, many different shapes and sizes of these army worms. We're going to talk about them a little more in depth as we go through this presentation, but you can see as you look on the right hand side of your screen, along about there in the middle, there's some smaller army worms. You get to the middle of the screen and there's some army worms there that reach up to about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in size. So when we think about the fall armyworm, there's two actual armyworms that we'll deal with in this area. The most detrimental to us as far as our forage crops is going to be the fall armyworm. Another one that we do deal with in this area and have dealt with about the last couple of springs is the true armyworm. Now, we don't have to worry about the true armyworm as much on our warm season perennial forages just because it's usually not out as much during that time. We have to worry about it a little bit more with our cool season annual forages, such as wheat, oats, and ryegrass. But we've had a couple of outbreaks this year for the true armyworm, but it's just not near as devastating. It's not near as bad as the fall armyworm outbreak that we have experienced over the last few years, going back to about 2015 here in the North Texas area. The outbreaks that have occurred have been extremely detrimental and have caused a severe amount of economic damage across the North Texas, southern Oklahoma area. So when do these outbreaks occur? When can you be prepared to go out and start scouting your pastures or hay meadows for the fall armyworm? Well, I can tell you going back to about the last 4 or 5 years that these outbreaks have occurred sometime between the first week in August. For the most part, we had some that we did see in July, but for the most part, about the first week in August through October. And so there's about a 2-month period there that we deal with here in North Texas, southern Oklahoma, that we need to be out scouting these pastures for the armyworm outbreaks. But we can expect a hatch to occur on a cool, damp day in North Texas. Whenever we get the fall rains, whenever we get those rains in August, September, that's when we can expect a hatch to occur. So you want to start paying attention to your pastures and hay meadows and scouting them at those times. Damage from armyworms is severe, extremely severe. This is a picture of a pasture here in Fannin County that was taken about 3 years ago. And as you can see, the grass, the leaves of this Bermuda grass pasture, the leaves of it are completely removed. And all you see as you look out through that picture is you see a few armyworms out through there, but mainly just the brown stems. And so we can have complete leaf loss during this time. We can expect the plant to go into a stressful state during this point, but we haven't experienced any actual kills per se of the plant itself. Now, when we incur a lot of stress on a plant, that's when we can have a thing that we diagnose as Bermuda grass decline, which can occur whenever we're not managing fertility, whenever we're not managing weeds. You couple all of that with insect damage as well, and we can start experiencing some Bermuda grass decline. However, if we're managing for fertility, if we're managing for weeds, and we just have an armyworm outbreak that comes in there and they eat all the leaves off, chances are, and we've experienced this many times throughout the last several years, if you can get a rain, if you don't have heavy grazing pressure on that, if you're not looking to take a hay harvest there real quick off of that, if as long as there's a little bit left in the growing season, you're going to get some regrowth that will occur on these stems. Cosmetically speaking, it's not the prettiest thing to look at whenever you're looking at it. As far as a nutritional standpoint for our animals, it's not a great situation to be in, especially if you have a complete solid Bermuda grass pasture out there, or crabgrass pasture for that matter. One thing that we don't see them affect is Dallas grass. So if you got a lot of Dallas grass in your pasture, they won't affect that. Native grasses, they won't affect native grasses either. It's just mainly going to be our Bermuda grass, crabgrass, Johnson grass, sorghum Sudan varieties such as hay grazer that we may go in there and plant. And then if we do plant some early cool season winter pastures, if we get weed, oats, ryegrass up in an early standpoint in the fall, those can be completely affected by the armyworm, in which we would have to come in and replant. So armyworm, size-wise, this is a full-grown armyworm right here in the most detrimental state. This one right here is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. He can forage for a while. If him and all of his buddies are out on a pasture or hay meadow, they literally, and this is no joke, you've probably seen it if you hadn't, where this is exactly how it happens. But you can literally walk outside one day and you have a completely green, lush pasture or hay meadow, and then you have an armyworm outbreak in which the armyworms reach 1 inch to 1.5 inches state in size. You'll go out the next day, completely brown. No joke. I mean, there's probably many of you on here that have experienced that before. And if so, it's no exaggeration whatsoever. And so what we want to promote is early detection of these armyworms. And we do that by scouting our pastures and our hay meadows. And this is the same. I know we're in a specifically talking about pastures and hay meadows here, but this is the same for your lawns as well, because they will affect those too. But you want to go out, you want to scout these pastures and hay meadows to detect them early. It usually takes getting down on our hands and knees, kind of parting that grass apart and looking down there close to that soil surface. You can detect them as early on as about 1/4 inch long. They're really small. They're really tiny. They're usually more of a lime green color at that point, but you can detect them. If we can go in there and spray those armyworms at that point with the labeled insecticide, we can get an early kill on them before they get to the state as in the picture that you're seeing right now. Because when they get to that point, we've got to literally either us ourselves go out and spray, or have a commercial applicator on call to come out and spray that day. Because if you don't, and they're that size that they are on the screen, the next day you're not going to have any forage left available. So how they go throughout life is they're gonna hatch. They're gonna start in that 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch stage. Then they're going to move up to that 1 inch to 1.5 inches stage. And then once they have completed all their foraging, they're going to burrow down in the ground and they're going to pupate at that point. That lasts about 10 days, and then they emerge as the armyworm moth, in which you see in that picture. Many people refer to them as millers. That's a term that you'll hear along about fall time, as people will say, are the millers flying yet? Well, that's what they're talking about, is the armyworm moth. How you can detect these millers is if you go outside late of an evening and you're walking around and you start seeing these moths fly up from the ground. Sometimes, as long as it looks like this, of course, during the fall we have a lot of moths that are flying. But if you see one that looks like this, kind of that brownish to light gray tan in color, it's the armyworm moth. It's laying its eggs, and then once conditions get right, you back up a few slides. Once we get a cool, damp day, that'll spur on a hatch, and boom, here we go again. You may be asking yourself, how many generations can I see in a year? When we think back to about 2015 and the armyworm epidemics that we've had since then, we've seen as many as 4 to 5 generations in one timing during that fall period. And so just some things to keep in mind. The next slide, I want to talk about the threshold. So when can you determine when you're going to treat or when you're not going to treat? So whenever you go out and you're counting, whenever you're scouting for these armyworms, once you reach the point of 2 to 3 armyworms per square foot, that warrants a spray of an insecticide that is labeled for fall armyworm control. And those insecticides are right here on the screen. I will mention is I have every webinar that we've done. I know that's pretty tough to write all of that down right there. If you'd like this slide presentation, if you just simply send me an email after we get done, I've already got it set up and ready to email out. And so just send me an email and we'll get this slide presentation over to you. So that may save you a little writing as we go through here. Some things to pay attention to, and we'll talk about this as we talk about the other insects in this presentation. But whenever you're looking at applying insecticides, same is true for the herbicides that we talked about yesterday during our weed control presentation. Is we've got pre-grazing intervals and pre-harvest intervals for hay. There's also restricted use and general use pesticides on here. And so we talked about that yesterday with our weed control, with the herbicides that we'll be using. There's also residuals that you'll see within these insecticides. So I just want to go down through here and talk about a few of these as we go down through there. One thing I'll make note of is we talk about these presentations, whenever we're looking at recommendations for utilizing some of these insecticides, herbicides, as we talked yesterday, that we can't recommend any specific pesticide for you to use. All we can do is provide a list. I know you saw that true yesterday in the presentation. You saw a list of herbicides available. Today you're going to see a list of insecticides that are available. As we go down through there and look, as you notice on carbaryl, that's simply your 7 products. You've got a 14-day pre-grazing interval, and what does that mean? Is that means that we can't have livestock on the area that will be sprayed for 14 days after the application of the insecticide. Same is true for the pre-harvest interval on the hay. Once you apply this insecticide, being the carbaryl products right there, you'd have to wait 14 days for a hay harvest to be done. Again, it is a general use, so you don't have to have a license to use it. Prevathon and Coragen, as you look there on the third of the list, one thing that we have seen with Prevathon, the active ingredient there that you see to the left of it, is that we have seen some longer residuals with that. Some say upwards of around 21-day residual roughly with that. You bump down to Besiege there in line number 4. And we've got one of the same active ingredients that's in Prevathon, but we also have lambda-ci in there, which makes that insecticide a restricted use, because lambda-ci, the active ingredient of lambda-ci, is going to be a restricted use insecticide product there, in which you would have to have a pesticide applicator license to apply it. However, if you don't, any of these restricted use pesticides that you see, you can have a commercial applicator. They're able to apply these for you. As we move down the list there, Dimlin is one that I want to point out here. Just some remarks on it. Dimlin, you can apply it, but it's only going to work on larva that's less than an inch. And so if you're applying it and you've got armyworms like we saw a few slides back that are 1 inch to 1.5 inches long, Dimlin's not going to work on them. If you do an early detection while you're scouting those pastures and you see those short 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch long armyworms, Dimlin would be effective on those. As we move down through there, we get into some of the lambda-ci products, the restricted use products down there. All of these that are on this list, I'll make note they're on there for a reason, because they've been tested and because they work. Not every one of them is for every person on there. Given your situation, what you're going to do is how you go down there and select which insecticide is going to work best for you. If you have any questions about the insecticides for armyworms, feel free to let me know. Moving right along as we get into grasshoppers here. You think back to about year 2016, 17, 18, grasshoppers weren't as bad here in Fannin County particularly. as they were when you move back to the 2011 to 2013 mark. When we were in those drought years, we saw them at their worst. We've been overtaken with armyworms the last few years. That's kind of plagued us here in the area rather than the grasshoppers. However, if you think back to last year, 2019, you probably saw more grasshoppers than you did in recent years. Reason is because these grasshoppers, as you see there on the first bullet point, they begin hatching in April and May. We think back to our last few springs that we've experienced, and we've had record rainfall during those spring rainfall events. Grasshoppers, the best thing for control on those guys is if we can get a lot of rain during the springtime, because they go through about 5 to 6 instar nymph stages as they're completing their life cycle. If we can have a lot of rain during the nymph period, it will actually infect them with a fungus, which will kill off the grasshoppers. So that's why we haven't seen the influx of grasshoppers in recent years, because of the amount of rainfall that we've been experiencing here. So it's been even though it's made it difficult in some ways, it's been good in a lot of ways as far as the grasshoppers, you could say. The best thing that you can do to try to help control grasshoppers is eliminate their food source. Their number one food source is going to be broadleaf weeds. You think back to the presentation that we had yesterday, we talked about how to get rid of those. If you can eliminate broadleaf weeds, you're going to have less grasshoppers during an epidemic. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind. Controlling weeds is going to help you as far as the grasshopper pest. As we look at the insecticides for the grasshoppers, many of them are the same as what you saw on the armyworms. However, one thing I want to make note of, and we'll make note of it again at the end of the presentation, always follow the label when using pesticides, because the label is the law. If it says it'll control armyworms, but grasshoppers aren't on the label, that means that it hasn't been tested, and it has been tested and didn't work on grasshoppers. So always make sure whenever you're looking at any of these pesticides, whenever we're talking about insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, which is another topic for another day, but always make sure to read and follow that label, because if your pest that you're trying to take care of is not on that label, it means it's not going to work. And so we've got a list here of insecticides for our grasshoppers. Another thing I just want to point out on there, on the Dimlin, you saw it for the armyworms that they had to be less than a half an inch to control them. When we get into the grasshoppers have to be less than a quarter of an inch. Dimlin's not effective on the adult grasshoppers, but nonetheless, many of the same insecticides on there. This is a new pest that we have dealt with over the last couple of years here in Fannin County. I would say, I think 2017, it's on the slide right there, was the first report that we had here in Fannin County. 2015, I believe, was the first report, noted reported case that we saw in Texas, and that was in Van Zant County. In the United States, it was first reported in Georgia in 2010. And so fairly new pest to our United States, especially a new pest to Texas, but we're learning how to deal and to cope with it. And now we have some economic thresholds to look at as far as letting a person know when to treat this. How this works is you have a fly, it's the Bermuda grass stem maggot fly, and it's going to lay an egg in the stem of this plant. Once that egg hatches, you're going to then have the maggot that will be inside of that stem, and it's going to be feeding off the inside of that plant. The contents that we see inside of that stem, it'll be feeding on it. And what will end up happening is you'll have the remains are going to look like this picture that's on the slide now. You're going to have about the top 2 or 3 leaves of your Bermuda grass is going to be brown. And again, make note on this one, it's just a pest of Bermuda grass, why they call it the Bermuda grass stem maggot. And so some management considerations that we can look at here. If you walk out and you see this, there's a couple of things you need to do, because we can get in times during July, August, September, in which drought stress, drought damage can sometimes look the same as Bermuda grass stem maggot damage. And so a detection deal, and I wished I could show you how to do this in person, but I'm going to try to describe it best of my ability over this webinar. But if you look at that picture there, if you were to be holding that grass in your hand, just as this picture is, and if you were to grab hold of one of those brown leaves that's up at the top and pull straight up on it, then it's going to pull right out of that stem. I mean, just as easy as can be. You grab that brown leaf and you just pull straight up. If it pulls right out and you've got a hollow stem there, you've had Bermuda grass stem maggot damage. I will tell you that we did quite a bit of scouting on this this last year in 2019. And there was one particular hay meadow that we were scouting. We pulled up about 50 plants that were all infected with Bermuda grass stem maggot damage. And of those 50 plants, we only saw one Bermuda grass stem maggot. And so usually when you see the damage has already been done. And so what do? If it's found within a week of harvest, as it says there on the slide, harvest as soon as you can and the weather permits you to. If you observe the damage 1 to 3 weeks after a harvest, it's likely that the crop will not add any significant amount of yield. And so what that means is if you get this damage in a hay meadow about 1 to 3 weeks after a harvest, and when we look at a harvest of Bermuda grass, ideally we're looking at 28 to 35 days. And so if this occurs on day 14 to 21, you're not going to get any extra growth or yield out of that because that plant's going to be prohibited from growing anymore because of this damage that's occurred. We do have some new guidelines for determining an economic threshold. And so what you can do is that link right there, whenever I send this slide presentation out, if you'll request for it, that's a hyperlink right there. And so you'll be able to go on and it will explain to you how to know when to spray for the Bermuda grass stem maggot and with what to spray are all listed on that. In pasture situations, you really don't have to worry about the Bermuda grass stem maggot is bad because if we have livestock on there, they're going to be keeping this graze. So if you do experience a Bermuda grass stem maggot in there, in that plant, chances are that animal's going to consume it and take care of it right there. So a pest of Bermuda grass, but damage is predominantly in hay meadows. And we're going to advance this slide on here. All right, so I've got this slide in here, and I will note that fire ants are not going to damage our plant itself per se. However, it creates an unfortunate situation whenever we're driving out across these pastures. Many of you, if you're fertilizing your pastures, if you're trying to spray pastures, whatever the case may be, this is a pest to the ground and to humans for sure. Also, I will make note that in hay meadows, it creates some challenges for us because when we have fire ants come in to hay meadows, we can essentially get those baled up in hay, and then when we get into a transporting situation, many times we'll have restrictions, and you can find that on Department of Agriculture's websites from state to state, but we can't have that fire ant being transported. And so in that case, we do look at it as a pest. It's not gonna necessarily affect the plant itself. The only thing is many times whenever we have fire ant mounds out in the pasture, you will see some pretty green grass on top of them. However, you're not going to have any livestock that's going to be grazing that. And again, as you're driving across these pastures with tractors and trucks, if you happen to drag a shredder across a pasture, fire ants can cause a huge problem for us. Again, another hyperlink right there. That link, what it will do is it's going to take you straight to our website for fire ants, in which there's a lot of really good information on there, not only for controlling fire ants in pastures and agriculture use areas, but also for lawns and commercial applicators as well for fire ants. Again, I want to make mention of this: when you're applying pesticides, always read and follow the label, because the label is the law. And there's my contact information if anybody may need that.